October 22nd, 1941 dawned cold and gray over the Winchester Repeating Arms Factory in New Haven, Connecticut, but inside the design room, history waited to be written. The United States Army had just designated Winchester's revolutionary prototype as the M1 Carbine, a weapon that military planners believed would change modern warfare. Yet, within 3 years, this same weapon would earn a reputation as dangerous as any German bullet not from enemy action, but from the men who carried it, abandoning it on battlefields from Normandy to the Rhine. The story of the M1 Carbine begins not with triumph, but with frustration. Throughout the late 1930s, American military officers watched with growing alarm as German blitzkrieg tactics rolled across Europe. Tank columns moved with unprecedented speed, paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, and the traditional concept of a safe rear area evaporated like morning mist. Artillery crews, truck drivers, radio operators, and supply sergeants' men who had always relied on pistols for personal protection suddenly found themselves in firefights they never expected. The M1 Garand rifle, that magnificent weapon General George Patton would later call the greatest battle implement ever devised, proved too cumbersome for these support troops. Weighing 9.5 pounds fully loaded and measuring 43 inches long, the Garand caught on tree branches during forest operations, knocked against helmets when slung, and prevented soldiers from wearing standard field packs comfortably. Moreover, the rifle's powerful .30-06 cartridge produced tremendous recoil that intimidated troops whose primary duties involved operating mortar or driving vehicles rather than engaging in sustained combat. Winchester's solution seemed elegant in its simplicity. They designed a carbine weighing just over 5 pounds, measuring only 35.5 inches in length, firing a specially developed .30 caliber cartridge with manageable recoil. The weapon used an innovative short-stroke gas piston system that made it reliable and easy to maintain. Its 15-round detachable magazine provided nearly double the capacity of the Garand's 8-round en-bloc clip. For troops who needed something more effective than a pistol but lighter than a rifle, the M1 Carbine appeared to be the perfect middle ground. Production ramped up with astonishing speed as America entered World War II. Winchester led the effort, but the massive demand required an unprecedented industrial coalition. 9 manufacturers eventually joined the program: Inland Manufacturing Division of General Motors, International Business Machines, Underwood Typewriter Company, Rockola Manufacturing Corporation better, known for producing jukeboxes, and several others. By mid-1942, the first M1 carbines reached American troops stationed in the United Kingdom, with initial priority given to forces preparing for eventual combat in the European theater of operations. The weapon specifications impressed everyone who examined it. At $45 per unit, the carbine cost less than the $85 Garand, while providing semi-automatic fire that far outpaced the $26 M1911 pistol in effective range and accuracy. The carbine's .30 caliber round generated roughly twice the energy of the .45 caliber Thompson submachine gun cartridge, yet the weapon weighed half as much as the Thompson and allowed soldiers to carry significantly more ammunition. German intelligence services first learned of the M1 carbine's existence through captured American equipment in North Africa during late 1942. Their initial assessment, documented in the Kembel zur Fremden Gerds, the German military's guide to foreign weapons, reflected genuine surprise at the weapon's innovative design. According to military historian accounts, German ordnance experts initially designated the carbine as the Selbstladekarrenner 455A, meaning self-loading carbine number 455, American. They appreciated its lightweight and semi-automatic operation but questioned whether such a compact weapon firing a relatively low-powered cartridge could be effective in actual combat. As 1943 progressed, more American forces equipped with M1 carbines arrived in Europe and the Pacific. Standard Army infantry companies received allocations of 28 carbines, typically issued to officers, non-commissioned officers, forward artillery observers, ammunition bearers, and selected combat infantrymen. The weapon seemed destined for success, and by all accounts, the men who first carried it appreciated its handling characteristics. Then reality struck. December 16, 1944, arrived shrouded in fog across the Ardennes forest, where 80,000 American troops held an 85-mile defensive line they considered a quiet sector, a place for green divisions to gain experience and veteran units to rest after brutal fighting. At 5:30 that morning, the quiet shattered as 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks launched Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, caught American forces completely by surprise. The massive German assault specifically targeted areas where American troops held thinly defended positions, and within hours Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units had penetrated deep into Allied lines. Confusion reigned as reports flooded headquarters describing German paratroopers dropping behind friendly lines, English-speaking German commandos wearing captured American uniforms, and armored columns rolling through supposedly secure rear areas. Private Daniel Morrison, an artillery observer with the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, 7th Armored Division, carried an M1 Carbine when his unit encountered SS Kampfgruppe Piper near the small hamlet of Bastogne on December 17. Morrison's battalion consisted primarily of support troops equipped with carbines rather than garons, and they found themselves facing one of the most elite formations in the German military. The encounter lasted less than 20 minutes. Kampfgruppe Piper's armored vehicles and experienced SS troops overwhelmed the lightly armed American observers, who surrendered after expending their limited ammunition. Morrison and approximately 150 other American prisoners were disarmed and sent to stand in a field near the crossroads. 15 minutes later, SS troops opened fire on the defenseless prisoners in what became known as the Montmartre Massacre. Morrison survived by feigning death, lying wounded among the bodies of his comrades. Later, when questioned by military investigators, Morrison spoke bitterly about his carbine. According to American Rifleman research, he stated that he had scored multiple hits on attacking German soldiers who continued advancing as if the carbine's bullets were merely stinging insects. "I emptied 2 magazines into a German sergeant at less than 50 yards, Morrison testified. "I saw the impacts on his field jacket, but he kept coming and shot my lieutenant before our boys with garons finally put him down." Morrison's experience was far from unique. Throughout the Ardennes offensive, American troops found themselves in the exact combat situations the M1 Carbine was never designed to handle: sustained firefights at ranges beyond 100 yards against heavily equipped enemy soldiers. Reports flooded back to headquarters describing carbine rounds failing to penetrate German winter uniforms at distances exceeding 150 yards, bullets deflecting harmlessly off equipment and vehicle armor, and enemy soldiers absorbing multiple carbine hits before being incapacitated. The German 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by SS Oberstgruppen für Dietrich, included some of the Wehrmacht's most experienced formations. Among them was the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, SS Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment, which had been given priority for supply and equipment. These elite troops wore heavy winter uniforms, carried extensive personal equipment, and possessed years of combat experience on the Eastern Front, where they had learned to fight through wounds that would have stopped less determined soldiers. When SS troops overran American positions during the opening days of the offensive, they captured substantial quantities of American equipment. Propaganda photographers from German units embedded with SS Kampfgruppe Hansen documented SS soldiers posing with captured M1 carbines during the offensive. These photographs later published in the book Nuts. The Battle of the Bulge by historians Donald Goldstein, Catherine Dillon, and J. Michael Wenger show SS troops running through Belgian villages carrying American carbines. However, military historians later determined these photographs were carefully staged for propaganda purposes. Jean-Paul Palade, in his comprehensive work Battle of the Bulge, Then and Now, examined the original German film footage and identified clear evidence of staging, including Belgian civilians casually walking through supposedly active combat zones while German soldiers performed for cameras. The photographs were intended for consumption back in Germany to boost morale by showing German forces seizing American equipment. The reality of how German forces actually regarded captured M1 carbines was far different from these propaganda images suggested. Sturmfähre Otto Skorzeny, the legendary German commando who led Operation Grief, the infiltration operation using English-speaking Germans in American uniforms, specifically rejected M1 carbines when equipping his special brigade. Despite desperate shortages of weapons and ammunition, Skorzeny's men preferred familiar German weapons or even pistols over the captured carbines. Wehrmacht ordnance officers who examined captured M1 carbines noted several critical shortcomings from the German perspective. The .30 caliber carbine cartridge used ammunition incompatible with any German weapons, meaning captured carbines could only be fired until their accompanying ammunition was exhausted. German logistics networks were already strained to the breaking point trying to supply multiple caliber types for their own diverse weapon inventory. They had no capacity to manufacture or distribute American carbine ammunition. Furthermore, German soldiers accustomed to the hard-hitting Karabiner 9.8K bolt-action rifle or the revolutionary Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle found the carbine's relatively weak cartridge inadequate for the brutal, close-quarters combat that characterized the Ardennes fighting. A veteran German Fallschirmjäger paratrooper captured near Mami later told interrogators, "We tried several of the American light rifles. They made good noise, but at 200 meters they were toys. We threw them away and kept our 98 kiloseconds." By December 21, 1944, the German offensive had pushed a dangerous bulge into Allied lines, but American resistance was stiffening. The 101st Airborne Division had rushed to Bastogne, a critical road junction town, and was now encircled by German forces. Despite being outnumbered and surrounded, the American paratroopers held firm, famously responding to German surrender demands with Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts!" The troops defending Bastogne included a mix of airborne infantry artillery units, tank destroyer battalions, and various support elements that had been swept into the perimeter during the chaotic first days of the German assault. Many of these men carried M1 carbines, and their experiences during the siege would prove instrumental in changing American military thinking about the weapon. Captain Thomas Wheeler, a company commander with the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, maintained a detailed combat diary throughout the Bastogne siege. His entries provide stark testimony about the carbine's limitations. December 23rd, Fritz attacked our position at dawn. Men with carbines emptied magazines at attacking Germans with little effect beyond 50 yards. Krauts walked through carbine fire like they were strolling in a park. Only when riflemen with Garans joined the fight did we stop them. Lost 3 good men today because their carbines wouldn't do the job. Wheeler's frustration grew with each passing day. December 24th, recommended to Colonel that all carbines be exchanged for Garans or at minimum Thompsons. Men are losing confidence in their weapons. Nothing worse for morale than pulling the trigger and watching your target keep coming. Several troopers have already scrounged Garans from casualties. The cold itself created additional problems for M1 carbine users. The weapon's non-corrosive primer ammunition, normally an advantage in preventing barrel corrosion, proved vulnerable to moisture in the damp, freezing conditions of the Ardennes winter. Soldiers reported misfires and failures to fire when moisture penetrated the primer compound and then froze. Garand ammunition, using older corrosive primers, proved more reliable in these extreme conditions. Meanwhile, German forces were learning that captured American carbines represented more liability than asset. When soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend Hitler Youth over an elements of the 99th Infantry Division near Krinkelt-Rochereth during the offensive's opening phase, they captured dozens of M1 carbines along with several cases of ammunition. According to post-war interrogation records, the division's ordnance officer ordered the captured carbines collected and stored in a barn rather than distributed to troops. "Why would we give our men American toys when they have proper weapons?" the officer reportedly stated. The American carbine cannot stop a man wearing winter equipment at useful combat distance. It cannot penetrate vehicle armor or destroy equipment. It is useless for our purposes. The barn containing those captured carbines was destroyed during an American artillery barrage. 2 days later, The German ordnance officer made no effort to salvage them. Similar scenes played out across the Ardennes battlefield as German units encountered and captured American weapons. Research by military historians indicates that while German forces eagerly collected captured American Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and Browning machine guns, weapons they could use effectively until ammunition ran out, they largely ignored captured M1 carbines except for isolated instances where propaganda value outweighed practical considerations. On the American side, the flow of negative combat reports about the M1 Carbine reached crisis proportions by late December 1944. The Ordnance Department, responsible for evaluating and distributing small arms, began receiving urgent requests from field commanders for additional Garand rifles to replace carbines in frontline units. These requests often came from officers who had previously praised the carbine's lightweight and handy characteristics. Major David Hartley, an ordnance officer with the Third Army, later wrote, "The bulge changed everything regarding the carbine. Before December, we couldn't supply enough of them. Every officer and NCO wanted one. After 2 weeks of fighting in the Ardennes, we were processing requests to turn them in for Garands or Thompsons. Men who had carried carbines for months were willing to shoulder the extra weight of a rifle if it meant having stopping power when it counted." The psychological impact of weapon failure cannot be overstated. Soldiers facing combat depend absolutely on their weapon's effectiveness. When that trust breaks down, when a soldier fires at an enemy and watches his target continue advancing, the result is devastating to morale and confidence. In the close quarters, desperate fighting of the Ardennes, where German and American soldiers often fought from positions just yards apart, weapon effectiveness became a matter of immediate life or death. As General George Patton's Third Army drove north to relieve Bastogne after Christmas 1944, they brought with them fresh divisions and much-needed supplies. Among these units was the 87th Infantry Division, which had recently arrived in Europe and was receiving its baptism of fire in the Ardennes campaign. The division's experience with the M1 Carbine would become one of the most thoroughly documented cases of mass weapon abandonment in American military history. The 87th 347th Infantry Regiment had been equipped according to standard table of organization, meaning approximately 28 carbines per company distributed among officers, non-commissioned officers, and selected specialists. These men had trained extensively with their carbines at stateside bases and initially expressed satisfaction with the lightweight weapons. Combat changed their perspective dramatically. During the regiment's first major engagement near the village of Morici on January 3, 1945, Companies Easy and Fox assaulted German positions held by elements of the 5th Panzer Army. The attack began at dawn across open ground covered in deep snow. German defenders, well dug in and supported by machine gun positions, poured devastating fire into the advancing Americans. Sergeant Robert Martinez, a squad leader in Easy Company carrying an M1 carbine, described the attack in his post-action statement. "We advanced across maybe 200 yards of open field toward the German positions. I fired my entire 15-round magazine at a machine gun crew I could see clearly. Nothing happened. I reloaded, fired again, still nothing. The Germans just kept shooting. Meanwhile, guys with Garands next to me were dropping Germans with every shot. Made me feel like I was carrying a water pistol into a gunfight." These recordings weren't generic background noise. Haptis had spent months collecting authentic sounds from actual engineering units building river crossings. He understood that German intelligence officers, many with combat experience, would recognize the specific acoustic signature of bridge construction. The recordings included the particular echo patterns created by steel pontoons being maneuvered into position, the hydraulic whine of crane equipment, and even the shouted commands of engineering sergeants directing their crews. According to research documented in The Ghost Army of World War II, these audio illusions could fool listeners even just hundreds of yards away, creating completely convincing false impressions of military activity. Radio deception reached new levels of complexity during Viersen. The Ghost Army's signals unit created an entire phantom communications network mimicking an Army Corps preparing for major operations. Technical Sergeant Walter Arnett, who had worked as an amateur radio operator in civilian life, supervised operators generating hundreds of false messages daily. They transmitted encoded supply requisitions for bridge-building equipment. They sent weather reports relevant to river crossing operations. They broadcast communications between fake engineering battalions and phantom artillery units, supposedly pre-registering targets across the Rhine. What made this radio deception particularly effective was its integration with actual military communications. The Ghost Army operators carefully studied the communication patterns of genuine Army units, replicating their timing, frequency usage, and even the individual sending styles of real radio operators. German signals intelligence couldn't distinguish between legitimate transmissions and the ghost Army's fabrications because the false traffic was woven seamlessly into the broader tapestry of Allied communications. The human element of the deception proved equally critical. Teams of Ghost Army soldiers, wearing the shoulder patches and insignia of assault divisions, made highly visible appearances in towns and villages near Viersen. They frequented local establishments, discussed their supposedly imminent river crossing mission with calculated indiscretion, and behaved like soldiers steeling themselves for a dangerous assault. Some even mailed letters from field post offices, knowing German intelligence intercepted Allied mail. Private Ellsworth Kelly, the future abstract artist, participated in one of these theatrical infiltrations. He and 3 other soldiers, all wearing First Army patches, spent an evening in a Viersen tavern that intelligence suggested was being watched by German agents. They played their roles perfectly, nervous young soldiers drinking too much before a dangerous operation, talking too freely about when and where they expected to cross the Rhine. Kelly later recalled the surreal experience of essentially performing in an enemy theater production, where the audience was deadly serious and the consequences of a poor performance could be measured in lives lost. The Ghost Army maintained Operation Viersen for 3 weeks, an unprecedented duration that tested both their equipment and their operational security. Inflatable tanks developed leaks and required constant repairs. Dummy installations needed continuous maintenance as spring weather deteriorated canvas and rubber. The sound equipment, running nearly continuously to maintain the illusion of round-the-clock engineering work, suffered mechanical failures that required improvised repairs under field conditions. Not every Ghost Army operation ended in unqualified success. The price of deception, measured in sweat, ingenuity, and occasionally blood, became starkly apparent during Operation Buzenville in late March 1945. The mission seemed routine: simulate an armored division preparing to attack toward the Saar River, drawing German attention away from the actual American thrust developing 40 miles south. But routine operations didn't exist when working hundreds of yards from enemy positions. Corporal Arthur Singer, a commercial artist from Chicago, was supervising the installation of inflatable tanks in a forest clearing near Buzenville when German artillery opened fire. The Wehrmacht had apparently detected the unusual activity and decided to probe with indirect fire. Singer and his crew scrambled for cover as high explosive shells detonated among the trees, shredding rubber tanks and sending equipment flying. Private Robert Dahl took shrapnel in his left leg, becoming one of the few Ghost Army casualties despite their consistently hazardous assignments. The incident forced tactical adjustments. The Ghost Army had always operated dangerously close to German lines. Their deceptions only worked if enemy intelligence could observe them, but German forces in early 1945 were increasingly desperate and unpredictable. Retreating Wehrmacht units sometimes launched counterattacks or artillery strikes against targets that would have been ignored months earlier. The Ghost Army's dummy installations, meant to deceive from a distance, offered no protection if German forces decided to shell them directly or, worse, probe them with ground attacks. Captain George Martin, who commanded one of the camouflage companies, implemented new security protocols after Buzenville. Real artillery and machine gun units were positioned to defend Ghost Army installations. Infantry patrols established security perimeters. The artists who had once worked in relative isolation now operated under armed guard, a reminder that their theatrical deceptions played out on a stage where the audience occasionally shot back. Despite these dangers, the operational tempo increased as Allied armies penetrated deeper into Germany. The Ghost Army conducted operations in rapid succession, sometimes maintaining multiple deceptions simultaneously. Sergeant Edward Bayou, a former advertising executive who handled logistics, later estimated his unit moved more than 500 tons of equipment across hundreds of miles during March and April 1945, conducting major operations in 7 different sectors. The physical toll on these soldiers intensified. Unlike conventional infantry units that rotated through front line and rest positions, the Ghost Army remained almost continuously operational. Their specialized knowledge meant there were no replacement units, no rest battalions to assume their duties. Corporal Harold Dahl, the sound engineer, later recalled working 80-hour weeks, catching sleep in trucks between operations, subsisting on cold rations because stopping to prepare hot meals would waste precious operational time. Yet their work unquestionably saved lives. Post-war analysis of German military records, conducted by American intelligence officers examining captured Wehrmacht documents, revealed the extent of the Ghost Army's success. In operation after operation, German commanders had redeployed forces to counter phantom American units. Panzer divisions were held in reserve against attacks that never materialized. Artillery concentrations were established to defend positions the Americans never actually assaulted. Intelligence resources were devoted to tracking divisions that existed only in paint, rubber, and radio waves. Colonel William Harris, who served as an intelligence analyst evaluating the Ghost Army's effectiveness after the war, estimated their deceptions directly contributed to saving between 15,000 and 30,000 Allied lives. The methodology behind these calculations was conservative, examining specific operations where German forces demonstrably redeployed based on Ghost Army deceptions, then calculating probable Allied casualties had those German forces been correctly positioned to defend against actual attacks. This analysis, preserved in classified after-action reports, provided statistical validation for what the Ghost Army's members had intuitively understood. Their art was saving soldiers' lives. The psychological burden of this knowledge weighed heavily on some Ghost Army members. They understood that every successful deception potentially meant dozens or hundreds of soldiers would return home to their families instead of dying in combat. Private George van der Sluis, a painter who specialized in creating dummy installations, later reflected on the moral weight of military deception. He described a conversation with an infantry captain whose regiment had benefited from a Ghost Army operation that drew German forces away from their actual assault route. The captain told van der Sluis that his company had expected 50% casualties but suffered less than 5% because the German defensive positions were undermanned. Someone else's son, brother, or husband was alive because artists had successfully lied to the Wehrmacht. This knowledge created a peculiar pride mixed with humility. The Ghost Army never sought glory. Their operations remained classified for decades after the war. They wore no distinctive insignia beyond their standard unit patches. They earned no special decorations for their deception work. Most returned home and resumed their civilian careers without ever discussing what they had done during the war. Yet they carried the quiet satisfaction of having discovered that creativity could be as powerful as firepower, that imagination properly applied could defeat armor and artillery. As spring 1945 brought the war in Europe toward its conclusion, the Ghost Army prepared for what everyone assumed would be their most significant operation, deceiving German forces during the final assault into Germany's industrial heartland. But history had other plans. By mid-April 1945, Germany's military collapse accelerated beyond anyone's predictions. Allied armies advanced rapidly against disintegrating Wehrmacht resistance. Cities fell with surprising speed. The Ghost Army found themselves struggling to keep pace with the breakneck advance, sometimes arriving at designated deception sites only to discover American forces had already captured objectives miles beyond their planned targets. Operation Malone, launched on April 18th along the Danube River, exemplified these changing circumstances. The Ghost Army was supposed to simulate preparations for a major river crossing, but by the time they erected their dummy installations, reconnaissance patrols reported German forces abandoning defensive positions and retreating eastward. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson, the Ghost Army's commanding officer, faced an unusual dilemma. Should they continue an elaborate deception against an enemy that might no longer be watching? Simonson decided to proceed. Even retreating German forces might regroup if they believed they faced overwhelming American strength in pursuit. The Ghost Army deployed their full repertoire: inflatable tanks, recorded sounds of mechanized columns, radio traffic suggesting multiple divisions converging on the Danube. But there was an almost melancholy quality to this late-war deception. Technical Sergeant Bernie Mason, who operated the sound equipment, later described broadcasting tank noises into an eerily quiet landscape, uncertain whether any German intelligence officers remained to be fooled. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. For the Ghost Army, victory brought an odd anticlimax. They had trained for years, perfected deceptions that could alter the course of battles, and operated continuously under dangerous conditions. Now suddenly, their unique skills were obsolete. The Army had no further use for inflatable tanks or theatrical military deceptions. Their mission was complete, but their contribution remained secret. Demobilization began immediately. The specialists who had been carefully recruited from art schools and advertising agencies were no longer needed. By June, soldiers started shipping home, carrying their memories and experiences back to civilian life. Corporal Bill Blass returned to New York and launched his fashion empire, eventually becoming one of America's most celebrated designers. He rarely mentioned his military service, and when he did, he spoke vaguely about special assignments without revealing the Ghost Army's true nature. Ellsworth Kelly went home to develop his artistic career, eventually gaining recognition as a pioneering abstract artist whose work hangs in major museums worldwide. His Ghost Army experience, with its emphasis on perspective, illusion, and visual trickery, undoubtedly influenced his artistic development. Yet Kelly, like most Ghost Army veterans, maintained silence about his wartime service for decades. The Army classified virtually everything related to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The techniques they pioneered might prove useful in future conflicts, military planners reasoned, so operational details were sealed. Unit members received standard discharge papers that listed their service only as special troops with no elaboration. The inflatable tanks, carefully transported back to the United States, disappeared into military warehouses. The sound equipment was dismantled. The carefully crafted doctrine of tactical deception was filed in classified archives. For nearly 40 years, the Ghost Army remained hidden in bureaucratic secrecy. Historians writing about World War II had no knowledge of their operations. Military analyses of campaigns in France and Germany never mentioned their contributions. The veterans themselves, bound by security classifications and habituated to secrecy, rarely discussed their service even among themselves. Family members knew their fathers or uncles had served in Europe, but nothing about the extraordinary nature of their work. This silence began to crack in the early 1980s. Some Ghost Army veterans, now middle-aged or elderly, started cautiously sharing stories. A few contacted each other, rekindling friendships formed under extraordinary circumstances. They began questioning why their unit's remarkable achievements remained classified decades after the war's conclusion. There seemed no legitimate security reason to continue hiding what the Ghost Army had accomplished. In 1985, a group of veterans formally petitioned the Department of Defense to declassify their unit's records. The request slowly worked through bureaucratic channels. Finally, in 1996, more than 50 years after the Ghost Army's formation, the military declassified significant portions of their operational history. Suddenly, military historians gained access to after-action reports, operational summaries, and the documentation that revealed one of the war's most unusual and effective units. The declassification sparked renewed interest in the Ghost Army's story. Historians began interviewing surviving members, now in their 70s and 80s. Rick Bayer produced a documentary and book, The Ghost Army of World War II, bringing their story to public attention. PBS aired a documentary in 2013, finally giving these aging veterans recognition for their remarkable service. What emerged from this historical recovery was a story that challenged conventional understanding of warfare and courage. The Ghost Army demonstrated that in modern combat, deception and creativity could be as tactically valuable as firepower and armor. These artist-stern soldiers proved that saving lives sometimes requires not greater violence, but more sophisticated application of intellect and imagination. The Ghost Army's legacy extended beyond their specific military achievements. Many members went on to distinguish civilian careers that shaped American culture. Beyond Bill Blass and Ellsworth Kelly, the unit produced influential designers, artists, photographers, and architects whose aesthetic sensibilities had been refined under the most intense circumstances imaginable. Art Kane became one of the 20th century's most celebrated photographers. Arthur Shilstone gained recognition as a leading illustrator. George Diestel found success in industrial design. The Ghost Army became a remarkable incubator of creative talent, though the connection between their military service and later achievements remained hidden for decades. Understanding the Ghost Army's full significance requires examining how military theory intersects with artistic practice. These men succeeded not because they were good soldiers who happened to know art, but because artistic skills directly translated into tactical advantages that conventional military training couldn't provide. Their story reveals profound truths about perception, deception, and how creativity functions as a force multiplier in warfare. The foundation of every Ghost Army operation rested on understanding how human perception works. Staff Sergeant John Jarvie, who had studied theatrical design at Yale before the war, recognized that military intelligence officers, analyzing reconnaissance photographs or intercepted communications, weren't seeing objective reality. They were interpreting visual and auditory information through cognitive frameworks shaped by expectations and experience. This psychological insight drove Ghost Army methodology. They didn't create perfect replicas of military equipment. They created convincing impressions filtered through the limitations of enemy observation. An inflatable tank viewed through binoculars from 2 miles away, photographed from a reconnaissance aircraft at 15,000 feet, or glimpsed briefly through artillery smoke didn't need to be perfectly realistic. It needed to match what German intelligence analysts expected to see. This understanding separated the Ghost Army's sophisticated deceptions from crude attempts at military camouflage. Consider the art of shadow. Corporal Ned Harris spent weeks studying how sunlight and shadow define three-dimensional form in military reconnaissance photography. He learned that German photo interpreters paid particular attention to shadows when assessing whether vehicles were genuine or decoys. A shadow's length, angle, and darkness provided crucial information about an object's height, mass, and